This next panel explores the process of donating treasured materials and creative works to archives with a particular focus on copyright. Navigating the donation process, particularly for content creators, brings up many questions about how their works can be used and accessed once donated. This panel, moderated by CENTRO digital archivist Lindsay Whitwer, brings together a diverse panel that seeks to demystify the donation process from the legal, archives, and donor perspectives to help future donors feel more prepared to advocate for their best interests, as well as consider what access to their materials and a relationship with the repository could look like.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this panel today. So I'm going to start up. I'll introduce our panelists. I'll allow them to talk a little bit about who they are, what they do, and then we'll jump into questions. And of course, leave room for questions from the audience at the end, because I think there'll be many. So first we have Emma Ephraim. She's the Associate Director of Legal Services at Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts. Then we have Cristina Fontanes Rodriguez, who is the Centro Archival Collections Manager, and Candido Negron, who is the co-creator of the television program Homovisiones and the co-donor of that collection to Centro, along with Gonzalo Alberto. So Emma, if you want to start off for us.
Sure, thanks, Lindsay. I'm one of the attorneys at Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts. We're a very small legal services team of 2 attorneys and a legal services coordinator. And we get a lot of assistance from law firms that we work with. As an organization, we exist to provide low-cost and pro bono legal services to artists and arts and cultural organizations in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. The types of things that we typically are assisting people with are related to contracts. You know, we can review contracts, we can have contracts drafted, we advise on copyright and trademark issues, we help to resolve disputes, we help with nonprofit formation for arts and cultural organizations, and every now and then there are governance issues that come up. And we also have an estate planning program as well. So we're able to have wills drafted for artists or people working in the arts, creators of all kinds, either for free or at a very low cost.
Thank you. Cristina?
Hi, everyone. I'm Cristina Fontanes. Like Lindsay said, I'm Centro's Archival Collections Manager. I've been Centro's archivist for a month and a half, maybe. Before that, I was the Institute Archivist at Pratt Institute, where I was also a professor of archival practice and archival theory. And before that, I was a National Digital Stewardship for Art Information at the Maryland Institute College of Art. So I've spent close to 10 years working in archival acquisitions, processing, and outreach. And that, of course, involves talking about all those donor agreements that were discussed in the previous panel, and working with donors in navigating what it means to give up copyright or retain copyright, and anything having to do with access to their archives after they've donated them to any repository.
Thank you, Cristina. Candido?
Buenos días. Good morning. My name is Candido Negron, and I'm a co-creator of Homovisiones. For the past 18 years, I've been a teacher, a high school teacher in Florida. So I've been living in a sort of like a bubble. And so coming back to New York City and talking about this, my baby, it brings up a lot of emotions for me, especially when being here means that there's so many of my collaborators who are no longer here, right? So it's just, I'm just all over the place right now, so please bear with me. I mean, I knew nothing about archiving. When we started Homovisiones, we started it in 1994, and we're celebrating our 30th anniversary next year. 1994 was a very important year for the queer community here in New York City, and in the country and in the world, right? Because we were, New York City was hosting the Gay Games, So we had athletes from all over the world here. ILGA was celebrating or holding its conference here also. So there were, a lot of people coming in for that. And of course, we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of Stonewall. So it was a very important time for us. We felt a sense of urgency as Latino queer men to document what was happening during that time. Um, not to mention the AIDS epidemic at the time, which was decimating our community. So it was imperative for us to tell our story, right? And so we didn't know anything about video production. One of our collaborators had a high a video camera, so we said let's just start recording, right? Let's just start recording. Let's start talking to people about their experiences, and that's how Homo Visiones came to be. We were living the moment, right? I mean, a lot of us didn't know if we were going to make it, right? In terms of thinking about archiving our collection, no, I mean, we were just right there in the moment, right? Capturing everything that was going on. So to be here 30 years later, talking about this project, right? It means a lot to me. The fact that there's Centro, right, is archiving our collection means a lot to me. For those of you who know anything about Puerto Rico, my family comes from Monacillo, and so I've come a long way, right? I've come a long way. Omovisiones was a 28-minute, non-commercial, news format type of program put together by amateurs, right? We were content creators, and our platform was public access television. So we aired in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, in Queens, and the Bronx. Staten Island was just too far for us to get to. So we trusted that people would share, copies perhaps of the show with people who lived in Staten Island. And in fact, when I say that people shared copies of our show, I mean, we knew people were making copies of our show, right? Remember, it was VHS, right? And they would be sending it to people around the country because we would hear from them telling us about that. We covered everything, right? We always said that the show was about life from a Latino queer perspective, right? So the fact that El Centro has our collection and not the Lesbian and Gay Community Center is not an accident, right? Because I think that it's about life, right? But again, from a queer perspective. Our relationship with El Centro has been phenomenal. I mean, back in 2004, when I was deciding to leave the city, we were just finding a way to just put away our stuff, right? So we just put it in a storage facility, right? Not understanding about the climate, right? Not understanding that video has to be preserved in a certain way, right? I just wanted to get rid of it, put it away, and that was it, right? My thinking was, we did it, right? We did the show, it aired for about 10 years, and that's it, right? Not thinking about the future, not thinking about the value of the collection. And so when El Centro, I think really, and again, you have to forgive me, but this was a long time ago, so I don't have all the details, but it was El Centro that approached us. It was Pedro Juan Hernandez and Jose de Jesus, who approached us and said, you guys should consider donating the collection to El Centro. And we were sure, why not, right? Luckily, El Centro decided several years back to digitize our work, right? And now that has given Omovisiones a new life, a new audience, right? We have been approached by producers, academicians, researchers, scholars interested in our work. We have appeared in 2 documentaries, The Stroll, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, and The Last Call, which is a series on Max, I believe. And that's when we learned about licensing agreements, right, which I knew nothing about. I just lost my train of thought. And so it's gratifying for me to see how Movisiones continues to live, right? El Centro, I mean, it's interesting to see the views that you know, I sometimes look at the monthly reports of the views that the hits that Movisiones gets, and we're being seen in Iran. I mean, you know, for me, I mean, to think that, I mean, that there are people in Iran, right, watching Movisiones is mind blowing. So I will end there.
Thank you so much, Candido. I think that actually sets the stage really nicely to kind of tell some of your donor journey, which we'll circle back into, and now kind of to take a step back from that, keeping that journey in mind, we can jump into some foundational questions to then get us back to the donor journey. So my first question is for Emma. Can you talk to us about what copyright and fair use are?
So copyright protects original works of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression. And that's what the legislation says. What it means is that copyright protects original works of creation that are put into some kind of physical form. And you know, those works need to have been created independently by a human. And there's a lot of discussion about that at the moment with generative AI. But so far, the Copyright Office is not registering works that have been created by AI, although we'll watch what happens there. And there needs to be a minimal degree of creativity. So just the slightest bit. You don't need to be an artist. And so that's what copyright is, but what does that, I'll tell you what copyright doesn't protect. It doesn't protect ideas. So when I say the work has to be fixed in a physical form, if you just have an idea for a screenplay and you haven't written the screenplay out, your idea is not protected. What you write on the page or type, that is what's protected because it's now in a physical form. If you're a sculptor and you have an idea or a concept or a work, that's not protected until you've done your sketch. Your sketch is protected, the final product is protected. Other things are not protected. Historical facts, processes, and systems. So things like recipes aren't protected by copyright. The actual rights that copyright gives you, it gives you as the creator of the work the right to reproduce your work, so make copies, the right to display it, perform it, if you are making works, musical works or sound recordings, the right to transmit that by digital transmission or radio streaming, and the right to create derivative works. So if I write a book about something, I also have a right to create a derivative work so I can write a screenplay based on that book. The other thing, so that's sort of what we talk about as being the bundle of rights that you get as the creator of the work. You also have the right to give permission to other people to reproduce, display, perform your work or create derivative works. So going back to the example of me being an author, if a screenwriter comes along, I can give them permission to use my book as a basis for their screenplay. Copyright is not something that lives forever. It's, depending upon what's happened in the creation of the work, differs if you've made the work with someone else. But if you have created the work after the 1st of January 1978, the copyright exists for the life of the author or the creator, plus 70 years after their death. So after you die, the copyright is passed on to someone else. The other thing I think to note is that copyright exists and your protection exists the moment that you create that work in physical form. You don't need to register your copyright with the Copyright Office. You can, it costs money, so you want to think about whether or not you need to do that. What registering with the Copyright Office does give you is the right to enforce your copyright. So if you're in a situation where somebody infringes on your copyright and they're displaying your photograph on their website without your permission, which is a copyright infringement, you can sue them. But you need to have your work registered with the Copyright Office. And that's a recent development as of 2019. The other thing that registering with the Copyright Office does is it's a publicly searchable database. It puts the world on notice that you are the creator of that work. So if somebody sees your photograph in, say it's hanging in the back of a bar and they're shooting a film in that bar, they can see that photo. Maybe there's some sort of identifier there. They can look up the name of that work if it's on there and see who the copyright holder is and who they need to contact for that licensing opportunity, if that's necessary. So that's what copyright is. Fair use is something that is mentioned in the Copyright Act as a defence to copyright infringement. A lot of people will think of fair use as a right or something that they have that allows them to use somebody else's work. We get artists coming to us at Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts asking whether or not they can fair use something. I'm using this music in my film, I'm using this artwork or this footage, these photographs. Can I just fair use it? It's going to be an educational documentary. I'm not making money out of this. That's not how fair use works. Fair use is something that you can raise once someone has sued you for copyright infringement, and you don't want to be in that situation. Having said that, it is something that gives us a guide as attorneys to do a risk analysis for somebody who is using material that they haven't licensed. No attorney can ever tell you whether or not using someone else's material in your work is totally fine. They can just tell you it's probably okay or it's risky, and then they can tell you how risky it is. That's if you haven't been able to license that work, or it's going to cost too much money, or you can't find who the rights holder is, which certainly happens. I've seen that happen. For someone who was making a music documentary, they had a VHS tape from a long time ago, and they didn't know who had captured that footage on the VHS tape. Typically, you would have to license that from the photographer, but it was probably going to be okay for particular reasons. And there is an analysis that goes on that an attorney will do based on several factors that are set out in the legislation, Section 107 of the Copyright Act. An attorney will look at what the use is. So if you're using someone else's material, is it for a commercial purpose or is it for a non-profit educational purpose? Just because you're not making money out of it doesn't make it definitely okay, but it is something that's influential. An attorney will look at what the work is that's being used. They will look at how your use of it is materially affecting, or whether it's materially affecting the market for that work. And what else? Um, and then an attorney will look at how much of the work is being used. And there is something that we call de minimis use, which is when the use of somebody else's work without their permission is so minimal that it's acceptable. And that happened recently in the Billie Eilish documentary. There was a scene with an artwork in the back, and the artwork wasn't licensed by the from the artist, and they sued. And the court said, look, the camera just pans across, you barely notice it, it's in the background. That's a de minimis use. So copyright infringement wasn't found. So that's fair use. The other thing that I will say in relation to copyright is some work is in the public domain. And public domain has a particular meaning in the legal sense. It doesn't mean anything that's just available to the public, like photos on the internet. It means anything that's currently not protected by copyright. And so anything where the copyright has expired, that will be in the public domain. So, music by Beethoven, books that were written in the 1800s. Because of the copyright statute changing over the 20th century, there are different rules about the duration of copyright. So I said at the beginning that copyright lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years after their death. That's if the work was created after January 1, 1978. But if it was created before then, there are other types of rules, and they kept changing throughout the 20th century, and it would depend on whether you re-registered or used the copyright symbol, and it was a bit convoluted. So if you are using someone else's work made before 1978, you probably want to talk to an attorney about whether or not it's protected by copyright and do you need to license it. Having said that though, every year work falls into the public domain just because it's now reached a point where it's old enough that there's no way it's going to be protected by copyright. So as of the 1st of January 2023, any work that was created in 1927 or before is no longer protected by copyright. You can use it. So next year, on the 1st of January, any work created in 1928 or before is no longer protected by copyright.
Thank you so much. So bringing this to archives, how do fair use and copyright function in particular in library and archives, and kind of how do these concepts impact the work of archives, archival acquisition and access?
As librarians, archivists, we are in the business of intellectual property, right? Like we have the things, we have the stuff. Sometimes the physical material has intrinsic value itself, but at the end of the day, we're interested in what's fixed in that medium. And then we are also in the business of access. Everything that we do, collecting, preserving, any conservation, any digitization, it's all in the name of access. So it greatly impacts the acquisitions process when we're dealing with people, for example, that don't want to give copyright. Not even so much so that they don't want to give copyright, because it's an example where that wasn't an issue, but where they don't want to provide access. In archives, we always talk about access and use. And patrons often mistake those two things for being the same thing. When we talk about access, we talk about what colloquially you may think about when you think about using something. Access is seeing something online. Access is coming to the reading room and opening up a folder and reading it. That's access. Using it is using it in your documentary, using it in your presentation for your class, and sometimes that's fair use, so it's fine. Citing it in your paper, that's actually using something. So we really focus on acquiring materials where we can provide access to it, whether we hold the copyright or not. And oftentimes that's really the struggle because we are not people's personal storage facility. We lack resources. We have a lot of people that want their materials safeguarded by us. We want to safeguard everyone's materials if we could, but we are not your personal storage, right? So we want to keep materials and preserve materials that people can use and people can access. So working with patrons, we really need to have an understanding on what they're giving up. If they're giving up copyright, for example, in every archival repository that I've worked with, we still have rights in that signed donor agreement that we can exhibit it. For example, here at Centro, that we can use it in social media, that we can provide access to researchers. We have a stipulation on there that just like mentions fair use, and we talk about it with patrons and donors because sometimes they've never heard of that term, so they think that since they reserve copyright, then they also reserve the right to decide who gets to see it in our reading room, and that's just not the case. So it's really a very complicated issue that we deal, especially when dealing with artists, creators of any sort. It's often less of a problem when we're dealing with, for example, family archives. People are just fine with giving up copyright to that, as long as they understand that they can access it whenever they want. Another thing to consider is that when you're signing that donor agreement, you're also giving us the material in perpetuity. So you may keep the copyright, you may keep the intellectual property, but we own the thing. So again, we're not your personal storage where you can just like after 20 years decide that you want to take it somewhere else and it's yours. Because you signed the contracts. Well, maybe you can sue or whatever. But you did sign a contract. So it really does impact every stage of the acquisitions process. And for us, it's very important for people to understand this. And I would also suggest that if you are in the process of donating something, that you ask all the questions that you need to ask, and that you also take it up with a lawyer. If you feel uncomfortable about something, and you could also, this was also mentioned in the last panel, you can show it to other archivists to make sure that the process is really equitable and it's a two-way street. And you should also know that everything is negotiable. So we always say we have a template, but that template also can be edited to your comfort, right? To the extent that we can, again, because we will not just take materials that no one can see. We heard from the Lesbian Her Story archives, and they were a little bit more flexible with that in terms of who can access materials and what they will allow for people for stipulations. But at a repository as big as Centro, we really don't have the infrastructure to say that each different collection has a different mode of access and a different kind of restriction, right? It's either open or it's not. You either have copyright or it's not, and we want the rights to exhibit it and to use it for our own purposes as well.
Thank you. And kind of building on that, could you tell us a little bit more about the acquisition process, in general, understanding that every one is different?
Yeah, I mean, it usually just starts with a conversation. Someone will find out that an archives exist or that their materials are actually valuable, if other than just having sentimental value for themselves or for their family. And it starts with a conversation. So we will ask, what is the scope of contents in there? Like, what are the themes that are discussed? Who are the people? What are the time periods? What are the places? We will ask about the formats and about the extent. So what is the quantity of material? And those last two questions are really having to do with practicality. It's really, again, since we are in the business of access, it would be really unethical for us to acquire materials that we cannot conserve, that we cannot preserve, and that we cannot provide access to. So, for example, we can't acquire like rare works of art that are in a fragile state because we don't have a conservator on site, nor do we have a conservation lab. Maybe we could get funding to send that off site to a conservator, etc. But those, are on a case-by-case basis. We also don't have infinite space. So if you have a huge collection, then we may not be able to house it. Speaking of which, we also don't have infinite staff. So processing a collection is a very time-consuming endeavor, and we don't want to take a collection that's going to be 10 years in storage because nobody has been able to process it. So something to consider is also sometimes you're being told, no, it's not because your collection is not valuable, but it's because it would be unethical for us to acquire it, given the current state of resources. So that's something to consider. a lot of people always ask about what they should be doing to organize their materials. It's helpful for us to know, to have like some kind of, in the archives field, we call it original order. That's very helpful than to get like a bunch of trash bags of material. But you don't really have to do that. That's what we're here for, right? We will work with at Centro and every archives that I've worked at, we engage in participatory processes, so we won't just keep your materials and organize them and describe them as we see fit and whatever after you sign the donor agreement. We will still be in contact with you if you want to. But we are trained for that, and we have the space and the capacity for processing a collection, which means organizing it if we have been accepting it. So you don't really have to worry that much about that. And then the other stuff is just practical. We will transport it to Centro, process it, create a finding aid, digitize it if it's part of the scope of the work, and just share it with you. And from there, it just we try to activate it in different ways, such as panels such as this.
Thank you. And I know you kind of alluded to it, but I wanted to mention that for Homo Visiones, one of the things about that gift agreement was that Candido and Gonzalo kept the copyright to the collection. So Centro we worked with CUNY TV Archives a couple of years ago to digitize all of the tapes and mini DVs, and we had to actively engage them in this conversation of like, can we put this up online and make it just completely accessible? Because that was how it was going to be digitized. And really, that's something, I mean, from digitization perspective, like that's how we get funding for digitization is free and open access to this material. So they were really generous with it, and we ended up having, a really wonderful collaboration between us and CUNY TV Archives. But yeah, one of the clear stipulations was that they retain the rights. So leading from there, how do you navigate copyright and archival acquisition, whether the donor wants to keep it or give it over? And what are some of the challenges when the donor retains copyright?
I mean, the challenges, like I mentioned, is just like educating the public. I'm also not a lawyer, so I've learned all of this on the ground. That is part of the challenge, and also educating the donor in terms of the importance of access, right? So it's not preservation for the sake of preservation. In order for these collections to be contextualized, to be analyzed, and to be activated, people need to see them. So that's a very important aspect of it. Some of the challenges with the donor retaining copyright is when you don't have proper information about the donor. So sometimes we will have collections, this happens in any archives, where you don't have any rights information. Or the only information that you have is that you don't have copyrights. But you don't know who has the copyright. You know that the creator passed away, you have no contact with family members, you don't know anything. So that's really a challenge. It's really not on us to acquire copyright information for the person who is seeking to use it. That's not our responsibility. But personally, we do feel some level of responsibility, right? We educate the person who is seeking to license, and we say we don't have copyright, we also don't have information, it's on you. But we also, we want to build trust with our community, so we just don't want to do anything that will break that trust or that will make it seem like we don't care that people are licensed or using their stuff without licensing, because we do care. But at the same time, there's just like some limits to what we can do. So that's really been a challenge. When we don't have copyright, the donor retains copyright, then the donor passes away and we have no information about the next of kin, about an estate or anything like that. Another issue is, even if the donor is alive, but in having the right metadata infrastructure to have that information, to have a digital collections portal that you're able to put in for each collection or each item different types of rights statements, right? So that also not everything is attributed to Centro, for example, as being the copyright holder. We have our archival collections database, archive space. In there, we also can put in the information. If you're working with paper finding aids, with paper donor agreements, that's fine too, but just as long as you have the proper infrastructure and documentation about your collections that tells you who owns the rights for each and every collection in there. Another challenge is also people donating materials and giving up copyright when they are not the copyright owners themselves. And that happens a lot as well. and they will just sign off everything. These are my friend's artworks, and he gave them to me, but he gave you the physical item. He didn't give you the intellectual property, right? It's the same when you buy a photograph, you're just buying that print, you're not buying that intellectual property. You can't just like make a book without photograph and sell it, right? So those are like the main challenges that we have, whether you're retaining or keeping copyright, is just knowing actually who owns the copyright initially, and then having in the proper infrastructure so you can document that for your archives.
And so what can a donor do to plan for long-term if they wish to retain the copyright? As you said, like sometimes we don't have that information from maybe possibly legal perspective as well as from the archives perspective. Like what can donors do if they're planning on keeping the copyright to their collection and we want to be able to, provide that access and use long-term?
Well, I mean, if an artist is keeping their copyright, it means any use is going to need to be approved by them, with the exception of use for teaching, research, and scholarship. There's a carve-out in the Copyright Act that says that it's not copyright infringement to use a copyright-protected work in scholarship, research, or teaching. It does make it difficult for the archive if you are going to retain copyright, but I'm in the business of protecting artists, so just speaking from that perspective, you're the creator of the work, you do with it what you want, and if you devise your work to your next of kin or whoever it might be in your will, that person is going to be dealing with the archives after you're gone. So, just from a legal perspective, my answer to the question is really the artist should do what they want. It might make things difficult and it might sort of defeat the purpose of why you're giving your work to the archive.
Yeah, I think it cannot make things difficult as long as we have everything properly documented. Another thing that we see a lot is and this is the fault of the archivist or the archival repository, is that when we create our donor agreements and we allow people to retain copyright, we don't put in there any information about who to contact or get permission from the donor to give out their information. So something that would be very easy for us is, okay, you want to license this that you found in our archives, here's the person that you need to contact. But sometimes we don't even have permission to do that. And again, since we are libraries and archives, we protect privacy a lot as well. So we can't just be giving out people's emails and phone numbers and addresses so that they can be contacted for licensing. So yeah, it doesn't need to make things more difficult at all. It's just a question of just everybody from the donor to the archives repository to cover their bases in terms of who owns this at the end of the day. And can we give out information for you to license, or should we just say to the documentarian, figure it out?
And also kind of thinking about the long term. As custodians of the collections, as archivists, we're not just thinking about tomorrow or the next day, which I think a lot of donors and content creators think they're thinking in the short term of their lifetime, but what about 100 years from now? Or what can you do to help build a sustainable practice so that there's clear access?
Yeah, another thing is leaving information for your next of kin. If you already know who that is going to be, or who is going to be your estate manager or the executive of your will, somebody. So not just your name, but that person. Because it's very easy for us to find out when someone passed away, but not necessarily who the next of kin is. So that will ensure that we will be able to provide access in the long term as well.
I would also just add that if one of the reasons why an artist might want to retain their copyright is because they want to know how their work is going to be used. And, you could do that by being the point person that approves every use, or in the donor agreement, you specify, you assign your copyright, but you also specify the conditions related to the use of your work. You know, there might be particular causes that you don't want to be associated with. So documentary filmmakers who are making a film about that particular cause aren't allowed to use your work. You know, when you are handing over a collection of your work or permission to use your work, you're entering a contract. And a contract is a negotiable instrument, and you decide what goes in that contract before you sign it.
Yeah, I think that's a very important part of it is maybe asking yourself why you want to retain copyright, right? Is it because you think you're going to make a lot of money licensing it? That's one thing. Is it because you want to approve each and every use, whether you're getting money from it or not? Like I said, everything is negotiable in that donor agreement. So you can certainly say, and ours says that you're transferring copyright, and this means X, Y, and Z. You could say I'm transferring copyright, but every use needs to be approved by the donor, et cetera, or and after death, this person, right? So not just because you give up copyright, you give up any rights at that moment. You can also strike an agreement with the archives so that you're comfortable with donating the materials and not thinking that it's going to be used or tergiversado in any certain way by causes that are not akin to your beliefs or why that work was created.
Great. So that sets the stage really nicely. So, Candido, you retained copyright, as I said, but then we had to come back to you and be like, we want to do this thing that kind of goes not against, but brings your rights to the forefront. We need to get your further permission to be able to digitize this material because we wanted to put it up on the Internet Archive and put it in the archives of public broadcasting where it also is. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about what your experience with that process was and some of the considerations that you and Gonzalo took into account as you entered into this agreement, but then also kind of the subsequent opportunities that it's presented for you?
Sure. I think earlier this morning in the first panel, you talked about trust, right? A very wise woman once told me that there are no accidents in life, right? That everything happens for a reason, right? And I think that when we were approached by El Centro to donate our collection, it was done through Pedro Juan Hernandez and Jose de Jesus, and we already had relationships with them. And so it was very easy for us to decide to donate the collection, trusting that it was in very good hands, right? But we also wanted to maintain control of it because, as queer people, we know that this could be used against us, right? So, when we were approached by the producers of the stroll, we wanted to meet them. You know, we wanted to talk to them. We wanted to make sure that what they wanted to use was going to be used. Not against us, right? Not against the community. And in fact, it wasn't, right? Because I mean, in fact, it was the director is a transgender woman. I think the producers were also, and so we felt very comfortable in giving them the right to use our footage. When we entered the agreement with them, again, I mean, our guiding principle is how are you going to use our material, right? And what is it going to be used for? And so we want to make sure that the material is specifically used for the said project, and that's it, right? And so, and again, I mean, I think our relationship with El Centro has been one of trust, right? Partly because I'm very ignorant about all of this, right? But again, we are in. I think we are where we're supposed to be with El Centro.
Thank you. And I have to say that working with you guys and reaching out to you was a long conversation. Again, just like with the producers, we really had, from our perspective, we had to lay out everything for you. And I mean, it was obviously our pleasure. We wanted this collection digitized and we saw the value. And so I think that was a really, for us, a very positive experience that we were able to work with you and come to an agreement about how to do this work. And since then, so the CUNY TV Archives holds the master copies of all these just because they're an AV archive, so it seemed like a better place. And we ended up connecting you guys directly with them for these types of licensing agreements and being able to kind of ease the conversation. How has that gone for you? Do you have any feedback on that experience?
Again, it's been fine, right? We've not had any issues. We welcome the opportunity to be online. I mean, it is where it's the most accessible medium, I believe. Young people are using online services platforms, right? So we had no issue whatsoever when you approached us to have or when CUNY TV decided to digitize our collection. It was great. It was for us. It gave Homovisiones another opportunity to continue and to help those. I mean, because visibility is so important, right, in our community. So it just became more visible.
Absolutely, yeah. So I want to do one more question and then open it up for audience questions. Are there any resources donors can look to or should look to when considering their donation, particularly in regards to their copyright?
Well, Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts is a pretty good resource. The services are so low in cost when you consider how much attorneys cost. And we can look through agreements for you if you're presented with one. We can also assist you with estate planning so that your work is dealt with in the way that you want after you've passed away. I think BLA is a great resource for artists.
Like I just said, talk to other people who have gone through that experience, talk to other archives, even taking into consideration the practical issues that I mentioned, such as space and bandwidth and resources. If the archival repository, the archivist, is not willing to engage in a conversation with you, talk to another archives. If they're not willing to let you keep copyright or let you approve who uses and how the material is used, etc., just go to another archives. But yeah, in terms of resources, I would say consult a lawyer before you sign off all your property to an institution.
Great, thank you guys. So I think we want to open it up for questions now, and I want to ask the first one via Zoom. The first one will be a Zoom question.
Okay, so one question from the chat is, what is an option for an artist, photographer who has gifted a collection to a museum and kept copyright to pass that copyright to their children?
You would have a will drafted that has specific instructions about what to do with that work. So the way that things work is if you don't have a will, you die intestate. And there are rules set out that state where your money goes, where your possessions go, how it's divided up. And it's sort of like a waterfall of next of kin. First to your spouse if you don't have a spouse, then to your children if you don't have children, then to your parents. There's an order. But if you want to make specific instructions about what happens to your assets, you would have a will drafted.
And thank you so much for your panel. I learned so much. I guess maybe this is for Emma, but do you have any experience or perhaps guidance on renegotiating a donor agreement or an agreement of that kind with an institution and a donor?
Yeah. I mean, in general, you can try to renegotiate an agreement. The other party has to be willing to do that. You want to look first in your agreement to see whether there's a modification clause that says that, this agreement can, or an amendment clause that says this agreement can be amended, if both of the parties consent and, that amendment is made in writing and signed by both of the parties. Sometimes that clause is in an agreement, sometimes it isn't. But the limiting factor in renegotiating is going to be the other party's willingness to do that. In a commercial context, which is what I typically am dealing with, that can be very challenging. But in an archival context where both of the parties to that contract are there because they value this work, they want to do the best thing by everyone involved, it's a much more wholesome sort of transaction. You might find that it's not really an issue. But I would say renegotiating any kind of contract is something that you can do, and it will come up if you're in a situations arise that you didn't think about at the time of making the agreement. But better to get it all right the first time around, and just know that once you sign an agreement, you're bound to that agreement. So make sure if you're signing anything ever in your life related to art or otherwise, you understand every single term of the agreement, and don't ever look over something and think that's just some legal language. It means something for you. And if it doesn't mean something for you, it shouldn't be in.
Hi, my name is Damaris Mercado with the Mercado Project. Producer, educator, curator by default. I'd mentioned in the previous session, but since a couple of you are new to the panel with regards to an archive that I've inherited around a lot of audio, video, and I have a bit of papers and other materials. So I asked a question before regarding social media and protections around copyright, and when you started out mentioning AI, it brought up for me a recent video that I had to submit all these requests to someone to take down because they took a photograph and manipulated my father's image. My project is on my father. His name was Ralph Mercado, and legacy and influence in Latin music on a global scale. So they took down an image. Well, they had an image and they manipulated his face to be talking, and also claiming that it was his voice doing a voiceover, which was not his voice, and created a video out of this photo that went a few minutes. So YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, sent notifications everywhere, was able to get it taken down and deal directly with, these people. Like, this is not okay. So when you talk about AI and dealing with protections of copyright, I don't know if you can speak a little bit more to managing that, because I'm finding a lot of photographs, everywhere. So that was that first question. The second one is in archiving materials and digitizing, if we're doing stuff at home or working with others to try to organize, what do you suggest doing with the original materials? Because now you're still holding them, right? And paying for storage or, trying to figure that out. So those two questions. Thank you.
Okay, I can deal with the first part. It sounds like someone took a photo that you have the rights in. You've inherited the rights in this photograph. Is that right?
It falls under one of the estate pieces. So because of the rights to his image, right? So there's like all this stuff that I'm trying to understand also in the place of copyright, between rights to someone's likeness and image versus the person who took the photograph,
Okay.
right? So there's like all these components to a creation of work, or holding the work and owning the work. So wanting to understand that.
Sure. So the copyright is held by the person who takes the photograph, unless they've assigned it to somebody else, or sometimes they can license particular rights to people, but ultimately the copyright holder is the person who takes the photograph. So I don't know who owns the copyright of that specific photo, but it sounds like this person has come along and created a derivative work, so infringed on that, the photographer's copyright or whoever owns the rights in the photo. And you mentioned, your father's image rights is what we call a right of publicity, and it's to do with protecting the use of someone's name, image, and and likeness in connection with commercial purposes. For example, if somebody's name, image, or likeness is being used to advertise this brand of water, that's not okay if they didn't consent to that, because that person might be very, very famous, and having them endorse this particular water means they're going to make a lot of money. So you can't just piggyback off someone's persona for the purpose of, for a commercial purpose. So whether or not that would really apply, I can't really say. But there are procedures under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that allow for a takedown notice to be submitted, which sounds like you did that, because this happens on social media all the time. People's work is used without their permission, and you just contact the host, and and you tell them you're the copyright holder. They're obligated to remove that from their site. They're not liable for hosting it, but they have to take it down. And then the person who had posted it needs to rebut, if they would like to say, no, I'm the real copyright holder. But that is often not the case. When it comes to protecting work that you have rights in online, it is difficult, and people have attorneys that monitor and enforce their copyright and trademark by scouring the internet to see if their work is being used. And so I'll say two things. If you are the person who has artwork, you can upload low-res images or have watermarks or something that's perhaps going to protect your work. You don't upload the entire PDF of your book. It's just page 1 and 2 as a taster or something like that.
Thank you for that bit also.
Sorry, what was your second question?
The other part is when digitizing materials, right?
Whether to keep the
Papers,
original.
videos, all of the things.
Yeah, I mean,
Maintain.
there are two schools of thought on that. I would never destroy the originals. There are materials that people often destroy the originals because they're just like they don't have any intrinsic value. For example, newspapers is something that people would digitize and not keep the originals. We have everything on microfilm, for example. But I would never destroy the originals. I would preserve it. Also, digitization is not preservation. You're just creating a digital surrogate for access. You also have to preserve that digital material. So that's also something to consider. Digital preservation is also very complicated. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure situation, even for archivists. So I would highly recommend preserving the physical material as well, the analog video that you have, etc. And we do have a DIY archiving booklet that talks about DIY digital preservation on there. So, but we can also give you some few pointers on how to do that. But yeah, definitely, that's very, very important to consider. Digitization is not preservation. So keep the originals.
Do they have to remain as heavily guarded, like in climate control storage and all of that once you do digitize them? Do you recommend that, or
Yeah,
it doesn't matter as much?
Well, it matters, but not everything. Film has different standards for where it needs to live than paper, for example. It also depends when the paper was created. That's also in the booklet. What I will say, it's more important in terms of temperature and humidity, is to keep it in a stable place. So keep it away, and you know that I feel like everybody has that room in your apartment that gets particularly hot in the winter, or that in the summer, that's where your AC is, and then it gets super, super cold. That's really more detrimental, that changes in humidity and temperature, than it just being a little bit too hot or a little bit too cold.
And I would
Thank
just
you.
add from the legal perspective, if you've been, you've inherited work, you've been given work as an archivist that's under a written instrument, look to the terms of that agreement to see what your obligations are, if any, in that written agreement as to how you should be conserving that work.
Thank you.
Great, so we have a,
Questions from the chat. So this is about oral histories. If you have oral histories, who owned the copyright, the creator, the interview maker, or the narrator, or both? And in terms, when it comes to donating those oral histories, is it sufficient to provide a release form signed by the interviewee when donating oral history materials to Centro or other archives?
Well, there are a couple of things there. So, it depends how the oral history has been recorded. So I'm assuming it's some kind of interview that's been transcribed, or it's been captured on a cassette or video, some kind of audio-visual format. The person that captures that and records it in physical form is the copyright holder of that work. So the videographer, whoever is capturing the interview, they own the rights in that video, not in the story. You would probably want to have a release if you're going to be using a video with someone in it. But in terms of copyright, if you are using a video or sound recording, you need to license it from the person who recorded it. And that comes with a caveat that that person who recorded it may have been working under a work for hire agreement for some entity, in which case that work for hire agreement would mean that the person that engaged them owns the copyright.
I have a question, but a quick mention of a resource, a fantastic book, Reclaiming Fair Use. I'd really recommend it. It's awesome and recent. My question is about IP protection and an archive hosting video. Does anyone have any thoughts about permissions to stream a video versus making it downloadable? I had an instance where I had, authority or permission to, make a publicly facing video, but no copies, no download. It needs to stream. Any thoughts about that in the archival setting?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because that's also something that you can stipulate in your donor agreements, that it's available online beyond the reading room, but that it shouldn't be made downloadable. And from the archival perspective, you can only agree to that if you're working with a platform that will allow such different settings for different videos or different collections. I don't have an opinion on that. I understand the risks for the artist or the creator, etc. But I also think that when things are online, there is just an inherent risk with people using it that we run.
And if you, as the person or entity that is allowing people the ability to make copies and download it and display it and perform it and stream it, you need to make sure you have the rights to do that.
In this instance, a company gave permission to stream, but no copies. That's been an issue.
Yeah.
great, so I think that's our panel. Herbert?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.